The Fazua Ride 60 is a mid-power e-bike motor that you find on a lot of lightweight e-mountain bikes, including bikes from Focus, Ari, Pivot, and Transition, including many others. You can get bikes with this motor that have batteries with capacities up to 480 watt hours. It's a pretty light motor and it's pretty quiet. And they claim that it gets 450 watts and 60 Newton meters at peak. Those are pretty good numbers for a motor with this small a package. And so we're going to test that today. I've got a testing lab here in my garage, and we're going to put it through the paces to see what power peak it really has, what the torque peak really is, give you some information about the motor that you really don't get from your manufacturers, including the curves of those measurements, as well as the all-important, I think, multiplier. I'm not sponsored by the motor manufacturer or any of the bikes that these motors go on. It's a complete independent test by me for your enjoyment and edification. So let's get into it. If you haven't seen my previous tests, you can check them out in a series of tests that I've done, and I describe the testing process a little bit more there. But basically take a power meter on the hub of the bike and a power meter on the pedals, and I can deduce what the power output and the torque is, as well as the multiplier of the motor itself. I was really interested in the Fazua motor in particular. It's a popular motor. It's also this mid-power motor, and I've really been enjoying the TQ motor, which is, I would say, one of its closer competitors, and because I really like the natural feel of the motor, and I kind of like riding bikes that have not full power, but just enough assistance to make the ride enjoyable for me. Now I'm running the test at all the stock settings, and as most motors, they have low, medium, and power mode that you can select from. I will be doing some tests where I look at how you can adjust the motor, so you can look forward to that later, but this test is just on the stock settings, which most people will use anyway. The Fazua Ride 60 uses labels. They call them Breeze for the lowest setting, River for the medium setting, probably meaning flow, and then Rocket for their highest setting. So we'll be testing each of those modes. And importantly, as I mentioned earlier, I will be showing you the curves. So the power and the torque and the multiplier that you get along the entire cadence range, which gives you an idea, if you haven't ridden this motor before, or maybe you have ridden and you're kind of interested in why it's doing what it's doing, why you're getting power at certain parts of the cadence range. So as you start to pedal faster and faster, is it a smooth transition as you move up that power range? Where are you getting the most power? Is it a lot of torque at the bottom, or is it easy? And importantly, I think it gives you an idea of if the motor really going to feel natural. Is it going to feel like it gives you all kinds of boost? Does it make you work for it? What are the characteristics? So let's look at the results. I'm going to start with power, and I'll go through power, torque, and multiplier, and each one of them I'll show you the results for each of the three modes together, so you can kind of see next to each other how the different modes compare with one another. So starting with power, you can see that the power curves they climb pretty smoothly. So there's not any abrupt change in power as you go up in cadence. It does start out relatively high, even with low input, which you can see particularly in the breeze mode. And we'll get into that later when we look at the multiplier and talk a little bit about that, because that's the one thing I think is really interesting about this motor. For each of the modes, the max power output increases by about 100 watts. So you go from breeze to river and so on. And each time you go up one of those, from breeze to river to rocket, it goes up, the maximum power goes up by about 100 watts. And it does climb more steeply. So you're gonna feel that as a big boost of power as your cadence goes up, particularly in the rocket mode. Now you'll notice that the maximum power output of this motor is not the 450 watts that Fazua claims. Now this is not unusual. Fazua is not the only manufacturer that is. In fact, I haven't found a manufacturer yet where the motor output at the hub is exactly what is claimed. And this is likely because there's losses between the motor, maybe even within the motor itself and the transmission, through the drivetrain to the hub. And normally I find a loss of about 50 watts. In this case, it was a loss of about 75 watts. So they claim 450, but the max I was able to get out of this motor was 350 watts. Now torque is another story, and I've said this in my previous videos. Torque is something that I don't pay a lot of attention to in terms of maximum numbers. You don't use the maximum torque. Let's look at the torque numbers here. As you see, torque does go up from breeze to river to rocket, but the maximum torque we see on my test is 47 Newton meters, and that's in the rocket mode. Now, each of these curves, the torque is relatively level. That means it's going to be a pretty smooth feeling motor. There's not a big bump in any case, except the breeze mode, which we'll get into in a second. But I want to talk about torque here, and I've hit on this in my previous videos, but the maximum torque a motor will deliver is always at the lowest RPM. That's the way motors work. Now, the motor manufacturers can adjust that with their software, and they usually do. Having a high torque number in a motor allows them to adjust and make these torque curves relatively level. So they throttle that torque down early in the RPM stage, or RPM, and as your cadence goes up, they begin to meter it out with the software until they get to this higher RPM, and then the torque is dropping off so much with the motor they can't keep it high. And you can see that in every case, it drops right towards the end. Now having a high number like they claim, 60 Newton meters, and I believe they probably do have a motor that puts out 60 Newton meters, allows them to keep that torque level throughout the entire cadence range. It doesn't mean they use it though. They don't use the 60 Newton meters at that low RPM. It wouldn't feel right. It would feel, the bike would just jump right out from underneath you. So they usually keep it pretty low. Even though say it's a 60 Newton meter motor, they don't use the 60 Newton meters. Where they use the high torque is later in the RPM. It's not the 60 Newton meters because torque is going down as RPM goes up, but it's not down to such a low level that they can't use it, if that makes any sense. They can continue to use relatively high torque, even higher in the RPM. So the 60 Newton meters makes a difference. You're just not going to see it. Now let's talk about the breeze mode here for a second. I mentioned I was going to come back to this. Look at 40 RPM, all the way down, all the way to the left of this graph. See how it peaks high at almost 30 Newton meters, and then it drops down? What that's doing, that's a very low cadence. When I ran this test, when I rode the bike, you could feel it. In fact, there was a point at which I was putting out maybe 20 watts, and that motor was cranking. In fact, when we look at the multiplier, you see how much it was cranking. But it was really giving me a lot of assistance without a whole lot of my own input. And so when you get on this bike and you start riding it, you're going to feel like it's an e-powered bike because it just gets you moving. Eventually, you kind of catch up with that, and it's very smooth and it's very natural feeling. But that beginning power and torque that you're getting, in my opinion, that's not a natural feeling. That is an e-bike. You know it. So let's look at the multiplier. Look at breeze. Look at the multiplier at 40 RPM, 6. That's a really high multiplier. That means if you're putting out 20 watts, like I said I was doing during the test, which is a very small effort, it's going to multiply that number by 6. So 2 times 6, 20 times 6 is 120 watts. So you're putting out 20 watts, the motor's putting out 120. That's a lot of power. That's getting you moving right away. Now, it didn't feel abrupt. It was very smoothly delivered. So I don't want to criticize the motor for this, but I think you're going to feel like it's a really powerful motor when you use it because of that. Now, for each of these modes, you can see In general, it's a relatively smooth multiplier curve. So on breeze, it stays right down at about 1.5 times your input. At river, it's around 2, but it does decrease as your cadence goes up. And that's because of the torque level going down, we saw earlier. And the rocket mode gives you about 3 times your input on average. But it does, again, go down as you start to pedal faster and faster. And you can see in my earlier videos, I call this sort of the party kind of curve where you're really not having to put a whole lot of effort out and the motor is giving you effort. And as you start to put more and more effort in, it's still providing assistance. It's just not doing it in the way it did earlier on. So it almost has this counterintuitive feel of telling you maybe you shouldn't pedal so hard. Just enjoy the e-bike as it is. That's why I call it a party curve. So I do feel like of all of these tests, the multiplier says the most about the character of the motor. So when I look at this multiplier curve, and I mentioned it sort of got that party feel, and I kind of categorize some of these motors as party or natural or Superman, which would be sort of the inverse of this, where the more you pedal, the more power you get out, and more multiplier you get out. Would I consider this a natural feeling motor? No. I think this is a really nice, smooth feeling motor, but natural, I wouldn't give it that label because it is giving you so much power and torque early on. Now, what I have not done is made any adjustments to this motor. And just like any motor manufacturer and bike manufacturer, they allow you with software to go in and make adjustments to the motor so it can suit your riding style. And that's really important. I'm a firm believer that you should make those changes because every rider is not the average rider. No rider is the average rider, and your power output and the way you ride maybe and is very different than any other rider. And so it's useful to kind of see what the motor manufacturer allows you to change and then make some educated adjustments on that. And it's hard to make educated adjustments without this kind of information. So I'm going to take that motor, run it through some tests, and show you what the adjustments on the software can do to the motor output so that you can use that information to perhaps customize the motor to your liking, to your power output, to your riding style. So look for that in an upcoming video. In the meantime, if you want to see other tests that I've done, particularly the TQ motor, which is similar to this motor, where I do give you some advice on, or at least some guidance on some adjustments you can make to that motor to make it suit your own needs, give you an idea sort of what you can do with these motors. Check those videos out. They're on my channel. This has been a really fun test to do. I'm looking forward to testing this motor some more. I really do like the motor. It was really quiet, really smooth. It's compact, so it really fits into the bike and makes it a nice light package for the bike. So until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.